Hi, this is going to be a short video kind of explaining about positives and negatives so that we can deal with questions like this or the somewhat more complicated questions when we have something like this and what that should simplify to. So I think the first thing to keep in mind is this is 2, and that's really the only way we say that. We could say positive 2, but it's 2. This, we have lots of different ways to say. We might say negative 2, we might say minus 2. I think the most useful way to say it or think about it like in your head is to think it's the opposite of 2. The very fancy mathematical thing we could say is we could call it the additive inverse of 2, but I think opposite is just as useful of a word for you to have in your head right now unless you really enjoy saying things like additive inverse. And when I say opposite, I mean if I have 2 and I have negative 2 and I add them together, I'm going to get a 0. Negative 2 is the thing that when I put it together with 2 makes a 0. That's why it's the opposite. It undoes the 2. So if I have negative 2 and I need to get an opposite, that would, by this logic, I'd want 2, because I know if I take negative 2 and I add it to 2, I'm also going to get 0. But if I used the negative sign to say the opposite of 2, I could use another one to say the opposite of the opposite of 2. Well, the opposite of the opposite of negative 2 has to be 2. So this is the opposite of 2. The opposite of negative 2 has to just be 2. The 2 negatives turn into a positive because there's only 2 choices. It's either negative or it's positive. It's either the opposite or it's not. So if I opposite it twice, it loops back to 2. This can just keep building. If I have well, here I have the opposite of 2, the opposite of the opposite of 2, the opposite of the opposite of the opposite of 2. And if you're like me, you're starting to feel like opposite isn't even a real word anymore. But I can make this simpler. Well, the opposite of 2 is just 2. So those can make a plus. And I get just negative 2. So I have this. I'm just kind of trolling now, but maybe I get there in some kind of story problem. Well, I have the opposite of 2, so that's going to be 2. So I can just go get rid of those 2. Negative, negative 2. Well, that's the opposite of 2, so that's just 2. So if I have one negative sign, then I get the opposite of 2. If I have 2 negative signs, I get 2. If I have 3 negative signs, I'm going to get negative 2. 4, and I'm going to get positive 2 again. And it's just, there are only 2 choices. It's positive or negative. It's going to flip back and forth each time. So that's the basic idea with all of these, like lots of negative signs in a row. So if I have something like 7 minus a negative 2, well, that's the opposite of 2. That's the opposite of 2. So that's like 7 plus 2, which is 9.